Well, greetings and salutations, test takers. This is Dean Tenney, the Series 7 guru, coming to you from my studio here in fabulous Las Vegas with our podcast episode on testing tips and tricks. I have some of these already in practical application where you can learn some of these tricks for your SIE exam and for your Series 7, for example. But one of the great things about our podcast, whether it's audio on Spotify or you're watching the video podcast on Google, it allows us to talk about things that are more generic to all the tests rather than putting them in a playlist. This channel is organized by your series playlist, and there are things that don't naturally fit into a playlist that do fit into the podcast. So today's episode, as I said, is testing tips and tricks. We're going to be talking about things that good test takers kind of know intuitively. And if you're a poor test taker, maybe we can formalize them. And even if it's not true, some people don't think taking tips and tricks is worth anything. I do, because even the placebo confidence effect can be positive in terms of getting you some points. I would also tell you that this is no substitute for over-learning the information. Learning the information is the best way to proceed. But there are tips and tricks that maybe can get you a couple points if you need it. And if you're on the edge, who knows, maybe that'll be all the difference in the world, right? So let me start by saying I learned something years ago from a professor of mine. He gave us 5 essay topics, 3 of which he was going to choose from the 5, and then we would write on one of those 3. And what was called, I'm dating myself, was called a blue book. So you probably don't know what a blue book is. You can Google it. Anyways, when I got the 5 essay topics, I thought, man, God would not deny me this opportunity for this question. I spent all my time thinking about how I was just going to nail that question. I was going to hit it out of the ballpark. And anyways, when we got the 3, it wasn't one of them. And I wrote what I thought was pretty clever, kind of an introductory, paragraph. And then I answered the topic I wanted to answer. And my professor said, Dean, that was a brilliant answer to the wrong question. On my blue book, F. Again, I'm dating myself. That means flunk. Next time, answer my question, not yours. He said, see me, and, get good news. He gave me an opportunity to kind of answer the question. But I always think of him when I'm doing a test and making sure I've answered the question. So, this is a giant reading test. So we're going to talk about tips first, and then we'll talk about tricks. But I think of your FINRA or NASAA exam as a giant reading test. And as I always tell people in our previous episode on the day before your exam, that is why getting a good night's rest is so important. I don't know about you, but my reading skills are very diminished when I'm tired. And so you want to try as much as possible. Now, sometimes anxiety can be what it is. And, you may need to think about instead of the day before or night before, the night before the night before, so you can get some rest. But there's another thinking mind who's asked you the question. So, what are you being asked? There's some reason this question is in front of you. And so there's another thinking mind on the other side of the question. So that's one thing you want to ask yourself, a question about the question. What do I think I'm being asked here? And once you figure out what you're being asked, then what answers are available to you? I had a young lady I was working with, and I said, this is a challenging exam until you can figure out what you're being asked. At that point, it becomes a much easier exam. And she said, Dean, I think I'm halfway there. I can figure out what I'm being asked, but I'm not quite sure about the answers being offered to me. So that leads us to our first test taking tip, is make sure you read the full question. Now, in the Marine Corps, the F is not full, but read the full question. A lot of times you can miss a question. One of the things I say is read the last sentence first in a long kind of a paragraph kind of a question. But that doesn't mean you don't want to go back and read the entire question, read the question in its entirety so you don't miss something. Even yours truly. You can watch these, by the way. You can watch Dean in action on explicated practice exams where you can hit pause and then I talk about the answer. And you want to be doing the same as you're doing your practice questions. As we said, number 1 priority is to do intellectual inventory through your practice questions to identify areas that may need remediation. However, you also want to be practicing your skills as a test taker. And you'd be surprised how much you can improve as a test taker as you give it thought along the way. So the first question is read the full question. Then I would amend that by saying, or as an addendum to that, say, read the full answer set. What answers are being available to you? Now, that's important too, because there's sometimes answers that scream out. So sometimes I'll shop my answer set and it says one of the choices, for example, says varies from fund to fund as stipulated in the prospectus. I go, wow. I don't know what the question is, but boy, that's a heck of an answer. I certainly like that answer. So now, as I said, if you get one of those wordy ones, make sure you read that last sentence first, just so you know where it works out. So I was just helping somebody this morning, and they had an option question. I call them a time clock question. It said a customer sells one, I forget what it was, a August 35 put or whatever for 1.5. And then it says the option gets exercised and the customer sells the stock. What is the profit or loss? Well, there's a lot going on in that question. The initial setup, and then, you do what it's required. And so sometimes you just read that last sentence first. What's the profit or loss? Or the differences between whites and warrants. Warrants are, that last thing can kind of help you figure out where the question ends up. I like to project the correct answer. Now, I warn you that test phraseology could be different. So, for example, there's sometimes things I know and I go, man, I know this. So I read the question. I go, oh, man, I got a layup here. I know exactly what this question is. Oh, it's, for example, the classical balance sheet equation. I go, oh, I know that. Assets minus liabilities equals net worth. And then I shop my answer set, and that's not there. I go, what? Another way of expressing that same thing, test phraseology, might be different than the projected answer I have is, okay, so let me think about this. Assets equals liabilities plus net worth. Yeah, that would make it balanced, right? Balance sheet. So there's an example where I projected the answer of something that I know to be correct, but then that answer isn't in the answer set or offered to me. And then you got to just say, okay, well, maybe this is test phraseology. What's another way to say that? Now, I would also add that's one of the benefits of using more than one test prep vendor, because the way they say things can be different and get you used to maybe a different phraseology. Process of elimination. You can go through the answer set and I say, well, gee, I know that's not true, right? Or the except question, I know that is true, right? So process of elimination may not work to get you to the answer, but at least even if it's a process of elimination, you get maybe a couple answers eliminated. That's a 50-50. And a 50-50 is greater than, 1 in 2 chance. So you definitely want to try and use process of elimination if you can. Now, one way you can do process of elimination is just read each of the answers being offered to you and put a T for true or F for false next to that. You can do it whether it's true or false. That's the way I suggest you proceed. You can use your scratch paper on that. Just put A, B, C, D on your scratch paper and then write T or F next to that, that dry erase paper kind of, you can erase it. Anyways, you could put that, or if it's like violation, you could put violation, not violation on each of the answers. And like I say, even if you don't get, maybe I got 2 T's and it's all the following are true except, now I know I got a 50-50. And again, levering your way into better odds in terms of answering a question as a test taker is pretty important to succeeding. That'll work with multiples of multiples. Now, you don't get multiples of multiples on FINRA exams. I know you're going to say, Dean, my test prep vendor. I don't know of any test prep vendor that for FINRA exams that doesn't use multiples of multiples in their practice questions. However, those don't exist on FINRA exams. They do exist on NASAA exams. If you're interested in why those multiples are still in your test prep vendor's Q bank, look at a previous episode where I tell you about the old 7 versus the current 7. But anyways, this is really good on the multiples. Now, I'm going to do a shout out to Dr. Meredith. Dr. Meredith is the guy who wrote the original Series 7, the SAT, the Foreign Diplomats test. He was a legend in the art of psychometrics writing tests. And some of these tips and tricks that I'm sharing with you come directly from Dr. Meredith. And Dr. Meredith is a psychometrics test writer, would say, well, we're only supposed to whip out multiples as test writers for all of them or 2 of them. In other words, if it's not 2 or 4 of them, the proper format for a test writer would be to ask you if it's one thing, which of the following is true, or if it's 3 things, all the following are true except. So test writers sometimes would do that. So I'm telling you as a test taker, I like to first look at all my multiple choice, and that's kind of my default. I say, okay, I'm looking for 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, this is more true of the exam. I'm not talking about practice questions. And then I like to see, okay, can I eliminate one of those multiples? Or is there one I know? So, what I want is a strongly convicted one of these multiples, either one I'm strongly convicted, my conviction is it's definitely not true, or one that is true. Ideally, maybe I get 1 and 3. One I know is definitely true, 3 I know is definitely false. And then I can go again on my scratch paper, 1, 2, 3, 4, and say, okay, well, if 1 is true and 3 is false, and then I can look at my answer set and see what's offered to me that can has 1 in it and 3 not. And that too can get you to the 50-50. So one thing you want to be aware of in terms of answering questions, you know, uh, if you haven't been doing this for a long time as a test taker, some of you I know are younger, and you've been taking tests for the last several years, perhaps if you're coming out of college and now going to take year 7. If you're an older test taker, maybe it's been a while. But just in terms of answers being offered to you, remember that if there's a period or a comma and the last part of that answer offered to you is wrong, the whole answer becomes wrong. The answer in its entirety has to be correct, or it is not a correct answer. Now, some people don't like this, but it is what it is. That's fair game, can kind of do that to you. As we said, you want to be real careful about pivot words. Really important words that are the pivot of the question, or might even be a definitional thing. That's why the glossary is such an important studying tool. Words like least likely, most likely, except, material. Is it a material thing? Something might alter somebody's decision. Is it incidental? I would add the word safe harbor. Is it an exemption, for example? So these are some really important words when you're looking through the question. I can't tell you how many times a test taker will call me and say, hey, Dean, I thought it was a long and low, the longest maturity and the lowest coupon, for example, that is the most volatile. And then they missed it because it didn't say most volatile, it said least volatile. So it's very easy to get on the backside of these questions with these pivot kind of words. So make sure you got them. Except, material, incidental, safe harbor. It's kind of like learning a foreign language. And when you dream the foreign language, that's when they say you know it. So I guess when you have your first dream, that's the other reason you want to be practice drilling and rehearsing, is to get comfortable with some of those pivot words, whether it's a content word or whether it's a formatted word in terms of the question. In either case, practice, drill, and rehearse. Okay, so those are some tips. And the other part of this episode in our podcast, I want to go over some tricks. Now, we only use tricks when we don't know, right? So we just, whip out a trick and we don't know. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. Now, again, some people take exception with Dean talking about tips and tricks. You probably have some old school accountability partner who's going to say, no tips, no tricks, just do it the hard way, learn the information. And I agree. Remember that is the way to proceed. However, sometimes, there's some tricks that might be helpful and get us a point or two. One test taking trick is reduction to the ridiculous. I'm not quite sure about an answer being truthful or not. And so I say, well, if this answer is true, what would the world look like if I take it to an nth degree, reduce it to the ridiculous? For example, I'm offered a choice, let's say, that when the minor dies, the custodian takes possession of the assets. And I say, well, let me see. That sounds kind of reasonable on its face, but if that were true, that would lead to a world in which custodians are killing minors for their assets. That can't possibly be true, right? Reduction of the ridiculous. In one of my former lives, I've had many, lives over the years. Uh, we had a restaurant, and I can't tell you how many times I would have to use reduction to the ridiculous on the answer somebody would provide me, right? So one time I went in, and by the way, I'm a silent person at this place. I'm not actually managing this particular facility day to day. But anyways, I ordered a Lagavulin, which is a single malt Scotch, and they said, we don't have any. And I said, we don't. I was surprised to me that we wouldn't have that. It seems like this place would have it. And the answer to me was, we don't have it. We don't carry it because, nobody buys it. And I said, well, if it's gone, somebody had to be buying it, right? So, sometimes these are answers that are offered to you where you go, okay, that doesn't quite work. Another test taking trick, principle of mutual exclusion. I like this one, for example, when I'm teaching this trick. These are two answers that are different. For example, convertible bonds have coupons lower than non-convertible bonds is choice A. And then choice B is convertible bonds have coupons that are higher than nominal yield. So A says it's lower than the nominal yield, the interest on a convertible bond. One says it's higher. Those can't exist in the same universe. It's got to be, I don't need to read C and D, by the way. C and D now become truthful information, perhaps, that I can use later on. But in this example, if A and B are conflicting and they both can't be true in the same universe, it's a 50-50. It's one of them. The one I use to illustrate this is Socrates. So I tell you, Socrates is a dog. Socrates is a philosopher. Well, he's either a dog or a philosopher because he can't be a dog and a philosopher in the same universe, right? So the Sesame Street trick. Again, I don't know if you folks are familiar with Sesame Street. I grew up with Sesame Street. And one of the things they used to do is show you things like, apple, orange, pear. And then the other thing would be, I don't know, a carrot. Right? And then you'd say, which one of these things is not like the other? I was watching a show the other day. It was a game show, and it was Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. Now, as a test taker, I say, it looks like India is the different one, the one that looks different. So sometimes you can shop the answer and say, wow, this looks a little different than the others being offered to me. And I call that the Sesame Street trick. This works a lot of times like, for example, if it's tips, a lot of times you can pick the tip out as looking different. Now, remember, the distractors are the technical name for wrong answers. And depending on the test writer, he might be offering you something that feeds into your, using a trick, right? By offering you something that does look different but isn't there. Now, I used to teach a weekend class for men and women who come from Wharton and Harvard and Stanford and let's see, am I missing anybody? The cream de la cream of American financial education. And I had said to them, I was coming back from break, and I heard one of them tell somebody to guess B, and I teased him unmercifully. I said, I can't believe how many tens of thousands of dollars we have spent. And what you took away from that education is learn to guess B. Now, in that class, what I do when I give them their homework, their suggested performance opportunities, I would rip the answer key away from them so that they, couldn't just look at the answer key, and then they would turn it in. Anyways, the guy was teasing unmercifully. And, you're on my channel and you've been following me. You know that I tease past the point of being funny. I still think it's funny, and it's not funny any longer. But anyways, I went on and on and on the whole day teasing this guy. Next day, he threw his answers at me and he said, Dean, 44% of your answers are B. He said, Dean, we at Harvard, I think it was Harvard, did a study, and we found out that most people who write test writers, know that people in cram courses are told to guess C, and that C used to be your best guess, but now statistically, since test writers shy away from it, B is your best guess. Listen, you got to take things like that on faith, but I'm telling you, when I have absolutely no clue, remember, we don't go to the guess B trick unless I have absolutely no clue. And, some people say that's C, but I go with B. If I have no clue and I say, okay, I'm going to assign this to the universe, I'm going with the B trick based on that guy. By the way, since he told me that, it's kind of reinforces because it works quite a bit for me when I'm taking tests. And then another thing that people tease me about is too long to be wrong. Now, let me tell you why the trick works. Again, we're not using tricks unless all else fails, but guys who write tests, they usually start with an answer, and then they reverse engineer the question, and then they reverse engineer the distractors, the wrong answers. And so when you see this paragraph, you go, man, that guy really likes that distractor or correct answer. And a lot of times that's a correct answer. Now, I got to tell you, the people who tease me most about this are people who write tests, and they get really aggravated when I send them examples where they have fallen prey to this trick, where, in other words, they say, oh, this is ridiculous, Dean. It's, shouldn't be doing tricks. And I say, well, listen, you got one here and here and here. So now remember, we only use tricks when all else fails. So we are not saying that we are not going to learn the information. All right. Well, that concludes this episode of our podcast. If you have some ideas for future episodes, let me know. I haven't committed yet to the actual schedule, but I'm on track to be able to, do these weekly. That's my preliminary kind of a idea. What we didn't cover in this, as I told you, I want you to practice, drill, and rehearse some of these things we suggested. I want you, as you're doing your practice questions, become a better test taker. That's worth some points, being confident. If just not even more content that you learn, but you can, again, convince yourself you're a better test taker than you used to be as you progress, that'll be worth some points in terms of confidence. Confidence is worth points on the exam. So anything can do that. Now, what we didn't cover in this podcast, because I know some of you are listening to it audio, we didn't do memory aids, and memory aids would be some of those acronyms like DERP or BLISS or SLOBS or DI-90 or whatever the case may be. And every exam is a little different about those memory aids. And if you need a memory aid, I would suggest that you incorporate memory aids. I'm kind of agnostic about this, but what I mean is if it helps you, again, it's like a trick. You might want to consider incorporating your memory aids into what's called a data dump sheet. And you can get some good ideas from Google for your particular exam by just putting that in the Google machine, and you'll see what other people have thought important. I think you should make your own, and that's where you would put all your acronyms. Now, that is more helpful on, for example, Series 7 than it is in terms of, other exams. Like, I don't really think it lends itself well to a NASA exam, for example, but it does lend itself well to Series 7, for example. If I told you could have one sheet of paper with front and back, anything on it, what would you have on it? And I told you to make that. If you made that model of your data dump sheet, and every night before you went to bed, because that's when your brain is at its best, you started flushing that out. And every morning when you woke up, did the same. By the time you got the test date, you'd be able to do test time. You'd be able to actually flush that out on one of the pieces, two pieces of the dry erase that they give you during the test. So you might want to consider that. Like I say, some people find that helpful. Some people do not. I don't think it would be helpful for me. But if again, it's helpful for you, something to consider. Let me know if you think in a future episode. We do this as a video podcast and audio podcast. But if you want and you think it's worthwhile, I'd be more than happy to do a video podcast on a sample data dump sheet and maybe invite some people along and we can do it together. All right. So hope you found the episode to your liking. And remember, inch by inch, your exam is a cinch. Yard by yard, your exam is hard. And I will see you for the next episode of the Series 7 Guru podcast.